Okay, good morning, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Ellen Peters, who will give us the Daniel Kahneman Keynote at this conference. Professor Peters is the Philip H. Knight Chair and Director of the Center for Science Communication Research and professor both in the School of Journalism and Communication and in the Psychology Department at the University of Oregon. She's an academic expert in decision-making and the science of science communication. Her primary research interests concern how people judge and decide and how evidence-based communication can boost comprehension and improve decisions in health, financial, and environmental contexts. She's especially interested in the basic building blocks of human judgment and decision-making, such as emotions and number abilities, and their links to effective communication techniques. Professor Peters served as the president of the Society for Judgment and Decision-Making, and was the first American to win the Jane Beatty Scientific Recognition Award for innovative contributions to decision research. Over her career, she got funding of research grants and contracts of over $32 million, and that was when the dollar was stronger, so it's really substantial. She published about 200 peer-reviewed articles, a book, and dozens of chapters and other publications. When I looked at Google Scholar, I saw that she has over 55,000 citations with an H index of 84. So I don't remember the last time I saw someone so prolific. So it's really a great pleasure and honor to have Professor Peters with us, and please have the floor is yours.
Good morning. It is such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for the more than kind introduction. I appreciate that. But mostly I appreciate just being invited here today and seeing all of you this morning, so thank you for coming. It was a little hot out there for me, and so I actually came inside here to cool down, so I hope you're also cooling down now. I want to begin by saying just what a genuine honor it is to be invited to give the Daniel Kahneman Lecture. Kahneman, of course, is such a huge force in our fields. He shaped the work that I've done myself between his dual process theory, his program of heuristics and biases with Tversky, prospect theory, of course. These gave us the most powerful organizing ideas in judgment and decision research. And I came to this work because of that foundation, and much of what I'm going to talk about today builds on that foundation. What I want to add is a layer that his framework left partially open. And it's the idea of who is susceptible to what heuristics and when and why are they susceptible. I'm going to argue that individual differences in numeracy, numeric ability, as well as individual differences in numeric confidence inform those questions, and it informs potential interventions to improve decision quality. So I offer this work today as an extension of Kahneman's work, not as a departure from the work. In the next 65 minutes or so, we're going to talk first about the large welfare differences that are associated with numeracy. Then I'll introduce a psychological framework that I call the motivational mind that looks in a slightly different way at who is most affected and why. And then finally, I'll connect that framework to some specific predictions about behavioral interventions, when they'll work and for whom they'll work. Some of the predictions I'm going to talk about have been tested already. Some have not. They're just ideas that are theory-based. But what I'd actually like to do first is start a little differently and introduce you to my friend Ruth. So Ruth was about, 80, 85 years old when I knew her. I met her at a swim aerobics class. We used to do scissor kicks underwater while we chatted about family and her retirement and my work. And I was doing work for Medicare and Medicaid services at the time. Medicare in particular is our, don't tell anyone, but our socialized version of health insurance in the US. It's for people over who are 65 and older. And we were doing this work for Medicare, but I had not really made any health insurance choices at that point. I knew very little about it, but I knew that Ruth knew a lot. And so I would chat with her about some of these issues while we were, again, doing scissor kicks underwater. But then I finally realized that we were pretty close to running, and I wasn't entirely sure of what I was doing. So I asked if she might be willing to come to my lab and actually just work through some of the stuff that I was going to ask other people to do to make sure that I was asking the questions okay, because I just didn't know for sure. And she was, the reason I asked Ruth is because she was very talkative and very opinionated, but she was also very kind. She was a really nice person. And she very kindly agreed to come to my lab with me, and she arrived, and I had this huge stack of paper, which it was just different experiments that we were going to ask people to do. And I said, you don't need to work through all of these, but if you don't mind, just sort of start reading them, and when you have questions, when I've worded something in ways that weren't very good, just let me know. And so I went to the other side of the room, and I was doing something, I don't know, checking email or something, and I left her there. And I was just, doing little errands. And I suddenly realized that a bit of time had passed, and she hadn't said anything, which was really weird for Ruth, because, again, very talkative, very opinionated. And I looked over, and I realized she was crying. I had no idea why, and so I walked over just to check on her and said, look, are things okay? What's going on? And she looked up at me and she said, I'm not a numbers person. I'm not a numbers person. And what you've given me is just completely filled with numbers, and I have no idea what to do. And I said, oh, well, that's really helpful. And I shuffled away those pieces of paper. I gave her something else that I had sitting around to do. And I said, well, thank you for your help on that task. Here's another task. Can you help me with this one too? Just to help make her feel a little bit better. She worked on that for a little while I went back to think about why was she crying. And what I realized was that Ruth wasn't numerate. She didn't understand numbers very well. And that lack of number ability was preventing her from making good decisions about health insurance. And those kind of decisions in health are quite important. In fact, one of the things that we see in numeracy research is that there are health gaps. So that people who are less numerate are 40% more likely to have at least one chronic disease. At the same time, they take about 20% more prescription drugs, while not having the numerical skills that are needed to work through complex health regimens that these kind of conditions often require. But it's not just health gaps, there are financial gaps as well. So, with some people in my lab, one of the things that we did is we had participants who had completed 8 numeracy items. So they answered eight math questions, essentially. And what we found was that for every single additional item that they answered correctly, they actually earned about $4,000 more in annual income. That's a meaningful difference for a single math question. McCardle, back in about 2009, had spouses, so a husband and a wife, do just a 3-item numeracy test. They answered 3 questions. If both spouses scored 100%, they averaged about $1.7 million in wealth. If they scored 0%, they averaged only about $200,000 in wealth. That's a $1.5 million wealth difference based simply on 3 items that they answered. It's not just in the US, with Marcel Zeelenberg, actually. Catalina Estrada Meja, we did a paper with participants in the Peruvian highlands. And again, there, with a very different measure of wealth, we saw that numeracy was associated with wealth on top of all kinds of other variables like cognitive ability. But back to other financial gaps. In Germany, I believe, there was a study done where they had people do a single probability question. Among those people who answered correctly, they had 6.1 percentage points higher employment compared to those people who answered it incorrectly. Now, I can see you're thinking about endogeneity, at least to some extent. We'll talk about causal effects in just a moment. But before I get to that, I do want you to keep something in mind throughout the talk, and that's this idea of the numeracy disparities that exist. Because numeracy is not spread, it's not distributed evenly across the population. Women, for example, do tend to be less numerate than men are. As we get older, adult aging actually seems to cause declines in numeracy. And people who are less numerate also have lower income. They're more likely to have minority status, and they have less education. And so numeracy, there's these systematic differences in numeracy that are associated with people who are already vulnerable. And so as we think about this talk, think about that idea that the disparities that we're seeing in other ways, the differences in decision-making and decision outcomes that we're seeing, are associated with groups that are already more vulnerable. One of the things that's seen, there's a study that's done around the world with OECD countries. And in the US in particular, about 1 in 3 American adults are functionally innumerate in health and financial environments. And so this 34% of people can do only simple processes with numbers. They can count, they can sort numbers from smaller to bigger or bigger to smaller. They can do simple arithmetic, and they can use simple percentages like 50%. But they can only do that if there's not much other material around those numbers. If there are a lot of other numbers there, or there's text with the numbers, they oftentimes can't do even those simple processes. What this means functionally is that they can't tell the percentage difference between 2 risks that are shown to them. Or if they're trying to figure out when to get their prescription medication refilled, they know how many pills they have left, they know how many pills they take a day, and they know about how long the pharmacy takes to refill a prescription medicine. Even with all of that information, they can't figure out when they should refill that prescription medicine. And that's about 1/3 of the US population. In case you're curious, objective numeracy is measured with a math test. This is a very simple item that we give people. I'm not going to bother checking to see if you know what the answer is. But in a nationally representative sample of US adults, 83% were able to answer that question correctly, which means, of course, that 17% did not. This is a harder question. The chance of winning a car is 1 in 1,000. What percentage of tickets win a car? A lot of my undergrads actually cannot answer this question correctly. The answer is 0.1%, in case you don't know how many decimal points to move, or you just make a mistake. About 24% of US adults, again, a nationally representative sample, answered that question correctly. And so we have a lot of innumeracy in the population. It's not just the US, it's your country as well. Although I have to say the proportion of people in the US who have particularly low numeracy is much lower than I would have expected. It was very surprising to me. I promised you I'd talk about endogeneity and some of the causal effects. The first thing I just want to talk about is the studies I mentioned with financial outcomes, for example. They all control for demographics like education, but the financial studies also control for things like non-numeric intelligence. They might control for Raven's progressive matrices. They might control for verbal ability. And in fact, in the financial studies, they often control for multiple of those measures. So numeracy has independent predictive power. It's not just a proxy for socioeconomic status or cognitive ability. The health studies don't tend to focus as much on controlling for intelligence measures. There's just a different focus in that literature. What they tend to do is control for demographics, so they control for education and income and age. And then they tend to control for more patient characteristics, like do you prefer to share decision-making with your physician or not? And they tend to control for just characteristics of the patient-physician relationship. So they're a little bit different. But we also do have a handful of experimental studies that do show the causal relationship of numeracy to decision-making and decision outcomes in the direction that's predicted. So the studies alter adult numeracy using different kinds of interventions, but they've been able to show better healthy behaviors, better financial literacy, greater consistency of risk perceptions, more risk-seeking, and more patience with money. And there's some other studies as well. And so these studies are somewhat limited. The effect sizes are somewhat small. The sample sizes are relatively small, and they have limited follow-up. So there are some limitations to these studies, and yet nonetheless, each of them shows that causal relationship in the predicted direction. On top of that, today what we're going to look at a lot are mechanisms, and we will show causality at that mechanism level. So in economics and in behavioral research, there are, of course, these challenges of heterogeneity, in research results. And the field has struggled to sort of figure out why that's the case. And they've looked for moderators of what those findings are. So they've looked for things like, does cognitive ability moderate the relationship? Does some demographic, like education, for example, moderate the relationship? But they've struggled to explain why that heterogeneity exists. A number of studies, though, have been shown, including some of the studies that I myself have run. So I've looked at things like frequency versus percentage formats and how they change how people understand risk, but more for some people than other people. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later. We'll also talk a little bit more about how reducing the amount of information that you show people can improve hospital choices. But again, it's uneven. There's heterogeneity in the effects. And more broadly, default options, of course, protect some decision makers at the same time as they leave other decision makers behind. What I'd like to suggest today is that heterogeneity can be explained in part by objective numeracy, but it can also be explained in part by a construct that's missing in a lot of our studies of decisions with numbers, and that's the idea of numeric confidence. Numeric confidence, another word for it, is numeric self-efficacy. It comes from Albert Bandura's 40-plus years of studies into self-efficacy, and we'll talk a bit about that. But before I get into that, I did want to mention Ruth again, because a number of years after I was friends with Ruth and after we were taking these swim aerobics classes, I realized that I had actually missed something when I was talking with her. So when she originally was helping me with those Medicare studies, what I thought was that she was bad at math. And so she was bad at math, and as a result, she couldn't understand the materials and she couldn't make good decisions. But as I got to know her a little bit better over the years, we used to go shopping together, for example. What I realized was she actually was pretty good at math. So we would go into a store, and a cashier would give her the wrong change back, and she would catch it. She would catch it, and again, Ruth was opinionated. She would tell him. And so it actually wasn't so much that she was bad at math. It was that she lacked confidence in her math ability. That numeric confidence meant that she didn't even use her ability when I was asking her to make these Medicare choices in these experiments. And so that was my second lesson from Ruth, but I didn't figure it out for a number of years. This numeric confidence, it's also called numeric self-efficacy. And it's measured with questions. I think I'll show you them in a minute. But it's measured with just questions about your self-beliefs. Things like how easy is it for you to calculate a 15% tip at a restaurant, for example. And this numeric confidence ends up being quite important to decision making. It's actually a major driver of behavior and persistence when we face obstacles. And Albert Bandura did about 40-plus years of research on this concept of self-efficacy more generally. And what he found was that people who have self-efficacy in the domain, they simply engage differently in that domain. So with numeric self-efficacy, people who have numeric self-efficacy or numeric confidence is mostly what I'm going to call it today, they engage more with numbers. They persist more with numbers. They keep going when the going gets tough, and they work harder to overcome obstacles. And Bandura showed this not just in the math domain, but across a whole variety, virtually every domain he studied. He showed this importance of confidence or self-efficacy. However, this hasn't been considered much in decision theories, and that's the missing construct that I want to talk about more today. Because people, when it comes to math, when it comes to numbers, people aren't always accurate about who they are as a math person. So we have people who are lower versus higher in objective numeracy. And as I showed you a moment ago, numeracy itself is just measured with a math test. We literally give people math questions and we ask them to solve those problems. They do not like us very much. A lot of people do not like doing those kind of math problems. But they also differ in lower versus higher numeric confidence. And these two constructs are related. They correlate at about 0.45, but that leaves a lot of unexplained variance. And it means that there are people who match, and there are people who don't match in terms of their numeric ability and their numeric confidence. And in fact, here's some of the questions. When it comes to numeric confidence, and again, this is also called numeric self-efficacy, we do ask questions like, how good are you at calculating a 15% tip? Or how good are you at working with fractions? It even relates strongly to questions like, in weather reports, in weather forecasts, do you prefer getting that forecast with numbers or do you prefer it with words? And people differ quite a bit in this numeric confidence. In the end, given that correlation of 0.45, even though it's a relatively strong relationship, they actually are distinct constructs. And part of what we're going to talk about today is what kind of psychological mechanisms seem to be associated with each of those different constructs. In order to give you an idea of sort of how people break out on these two different measures, though, I took a sample that I had of I think it was about 4,500 people. This was in the US. And just did a median split on both of those measures, and then just looked at, okay, how do they fall out on this measure? And what you can see in the intuitive cells is that about 35% of people, that's in the lower right, about 35% of people are higher in objective numeracy and higher in numeric confidence. So they have the skills and they know it. It's not super surprising. And then about 34% of the people are lower in objective numeracy. They didn't do well on the math test, but they also know it. They're also lower in numeric confidence. So these are kind of intuitive. They make sense. People have skills or don't have skills, and they realize it. But then we have these other two cells. These are the less intuitive cells, because we have people like Ruth in the upper right who are higher in objective numeracy but lower in numeric confidence. So these are people who have mathematical skills, but who don't realize that they have those skills. And then we have the group in the lower left. These are people who don't have good math skills. They're lower in objective ability, but they actually have quite high numeric confidence. And according to self-efficacy theory, these people who don't have the skills but do have the numeric confidence, they're going to persist with numbers that they don't understand. They're probably going to be making mistakes that they don't notice, and these are the people who may make the worst decisions as a result. And we're going to look a little bit at that. The way that I want to look at it is through two studies, one of which is with lupus patients, and one of which is with financial outcomes. So in the earlier health and financial outcomes data that I showed you, those were all self-reported data. And here what I want to do with lupus patients is look at a different kind of measure. We're actually going to look at data that's pulled out of the patient's medical records, and for lupus in particular. Lupus, for those of you who don't know, is an autoimmune disease. And it's an autoimmune disease where the body attacks its own tissues, and it causes widespread inflammation in the body. It can cause painful joints. It can cause kind of a telltale rash, and a whole variety of other symptoms. It's a whole body autoimmune disease. There is no cure for lupus at this point in time, which is unfortunate, but it is also the case that medical interventions as well as lifestyle changes can actually help people to manage their disease and to manage their symptoms. But here's the kicker. The disease is fairly numeric. The disease requires numeric ability a lot of the time. So it requires numeric ability for people to understand the risks and the benefits of medications, for example. It requires numeric ability to be able to figure out some of the complex medication regimens that change over time. And not only does it require numeric ability, but it requires persistence with numbers, to keep on adhering to medicines, to medications, to continue to adhere to healthy behaviors. And that kind of persistence is what we know is associated with, in this case, numeric self-efficacy or numeric confidence. And so what we thought would happen, and I was working with a couple of rheumatologists, what we thought would happen is that the disease activity that was in patients' medical records that their physician recorded, that would be associated with both their objective numeric abilities as well as their numeric confidence. And so we recruited 91 lupus patients from the Ohio State University system. Each of them completed both of our measures, and we asked for their permission to actually look into their medical records to see what their actual disease activity was as recorded by their physician. And here's what we found. On the y-axis there, those are the disease activity scores. And one thing to know about disease activity is you don't want high disease activity. You want low disease activity. If you're a patient, you want the lowest disease activity possible, so lower is better on this scale. On my x-axis are the objective numeracy scores going from lower numeracy on the left to higher numeracy on the right. And then I have two lines. The solid line are people who are higher in numeric confidence, and the dotted line are people who are lower in numeric confidence. And let's start first on the right-hand side. So what I circled there were the people who are high in objective ability, and they're on the solid line, so they're high in numeric confidence as well. And what you can see is that this group has the lowest disease activity among all of these groups. And in fact, they're substantially lower in disease activity compared to those people who are equally confident, but they're low in ability. And what we think happens is that those people on the right-hand side who are high in ability and they're high in confidence, they persist in their actions, and they have the ability to support the actions that they're taking with numbers in order to manage that disease. Compared to the people on the left-hand side who are circled, those people are equally as confident, they're persisting with numbers, they're engaging with numbers, but they don't have the ability to support it. And so we think, again, that they make mistakes that go unrecognized, and they, in fact, have the highest disease activity among these groups. Now, if you look at the people who are on the dotted line, on the right-hand side, these are people who are equally as numerate as the high numerate, high confidence group that I'd circled below them, but these people don't have confidence. This is like Ruth. And what we think happens here is that even though they have the ability, they don't persist with numbers, and they ultimately don't use their ability, and they do less well as a result. They have higher disease activity. And in fact, their disease activity isn't very different from people who have the same low numeric confidence, but they're actually quite low in ability. They don't differ much from them. So this is a relatively small clinical sample. It's actually a meaningful sample for clinical samples. It's a patient study, so 91 patients are actually a pretty big sample to accrue. But it's a pretty small sample, and we were interested in looking to see, is it possible that this relationship, that this interaction between numeric ability and numeric confidence might actually show in a larger sample. And so we turned to a large national sample that's representative in the US, and we took a look at positive financial outcomes. So here, the positive financial outcomes were very big things. There were things like, have you ever defaulted on your mortgage? Do you have retirement savings? Having retirement savings in the US is quite important. Other things like, do you have $5,000 in credit card debt? And so there are a lot of big financial questions. And then what we did is we made sure we turned them all in the positive direction, and then we simply summed them up to these positive financial outcomes that I now have on the y-axis. Now here, of course, higher numbers are better. You want to experience more positive financial outcomes, not less. So it's the opposite in some senses from the lupus study. What I have again on the x-axis are those objective numeracy scores. The solid line is high numeric confidence. The dotted line is low numeric confidence. And what we show is the same interaction. If you take a look again first at that on the high ability side, people who have high ability as well as high confidence, they're the ones who experience the most financial outcomes, compared to those people who are just as high in numeric confidence, but they're low in ability. And they experience significantly less positive financial outcomes. When you look at people who are low in numeric confidence, these are people who are equally as able as the original group I mentioned, but they don't have the confidence, like Ruth. They don't seem to use their numeric ability. They seem not to persist with numbers, And they don't do as well in terms of the financial outcomes. In fact, they do approximately as well as people who are just as low in numeric confidence, but who are actually much lower in ability. Again, what we think happens is that when you have this confidence and this self-efficacy, you engage in that domain. In this case, it's a number domain. And when you engage in that number domain, you use your abilities and you persist. And even when the going gets tough and you're bored or it's difficult, you keep going and you try harder. And you do better if you have the ability, but you do worse if you don't have the ability. So we're going to talk about some of those mechanisms in a moment that underlie these constructs. But before we go on, I do want to show you one additional study that I thought you might find interesting. Here we look just at objective numeracy. We did not look at numeric confidence. But what we were interested in was connecting numeracy to the Easterlin paradox, the idea that income, and especially relative income, are associated with well-being. This is also in the social comparison literature, of course. And what we did, we thought that what might happen is that people who are higher in ability might actually be the ones who compare numbers. It might actually be the ones, as a result, who show more of this relative income effect. And I'll show you a possible mechanism for that in a moment. But let me show you the data first, if you don't mind. We had about 5,800 participants. They were panel members in the Understanding America study. And in that panel, they were asked just simply, how satisfied are you with your life? They were also asked, how satisfied were you with your income? And that shows similar results, but I'm not going to show you those data today. But in terms of life satisfaction, they simply answered on a scale from 0 to 10, not at all, to completely, in terms of satisfied with life. And then we took a look at how objective numeracy relates to their life satisfaction. What you can see in terms of income as well, what you can see here is first on the y-axis are those life satisfaction scores that people reported. The x-axis, again, is objective numeracy. And now my lines have to do with income. They're either people who are one standard deviation above the mean for income. Those are the higher income people on top in the red line. The middle line is average income, and then the bottom line will be lower income. But let's start with the high income people. What you can see is that among those people who have high income, with higher objective numeracy scores, they're more satisfied with their life. They're less satisfied with their life when they have lower objective numeracy scores. And then we can look at the lower income line. And so while the high income line is perhaps kind of intuitive, the low income line, for me at least, I found somewhat less intuitive. Among these low income people, the higher their objective numeracy scores, the lower their life satisfaction. And so what you see is that among people who are very high in objective numeracy, they have both the highest life satisfaction in the group as well as the lowest life satisfaction in the group. And what we think happens is that among those people who are very high in objective numeracy, we think they're the ones who are comparing their own income to that of others. And if they're high in income, they notice, and they like it, and they feel good about it, and they're more satisfied with their life. But if they're lower in income, they're still highly numerate, and we think they know where they stand compared to others, and they're not as happy. Among those people who are low in objective numeracy, they might have the same high income or the same low income, but we think they don't make that comparison to others' income. And as a result, it doesn't make much of a difference to them. And so comparison can be the thief of joy in some ways, but only if you make that comparison. What I want to do in a moment is start to talk about some of those mechanisms and why I think some of these data appear. But before that, I do want to return to Danny Kahneman's work a little bit first and just connect it a little bit more with what we're going to be talking about. As we talked before, he gave us some of the most important organizing frameworks, probably the most important organizing frameworks in judgment and decision research. That idea of two processes, of systematic biases and of predictable departures from rationality. Numeracy and numeric confidence, I'm arguing, then adds a layer to his framework. Again, which people show which biases, and why do they show those biases? For example, Kahneman's dual process theory describes fast intuitive processing, these type 1 processes, compared to slow, more deliberative type 2 kinds of processes. The work I'm going to talk about today asks the question of who engages with numbers and with what process. And the answer, as I'll talk about, is that we think that numeracy and confidence determine whether people enter into deliberative processing with numbers, including more deliberative affect through number comparisons. And it also predicts those people who will rely more on more superficial forms of processing and more superficial forms of information. Kahneman also, of course, contributed that idea that heuristics and biases are widespread. He and Tversky documented these heuristics and biases across decades of research. And the work I'll talk about today asks about which individual differences will predict who is susceptible and how much. And what we'll talk about is that the less numerate, the people who score less well on a math test, are generally more susceptible to heuristic effects across the variety of heuristics that Kahneman and Tversky developed. However, the more numerate you'll see are actually more susceptible to numeric comparison effects. That latter mechanism seems to be due to greater number habits that the highly numerate have that the less numerate simply don't possess. And then third, Kahneman, of course, talked about expected utility violations and their systematic nature through prospect theory in particular. And this work is going to ask, could there be a novel source of violation from simply doing math? And then who shows that the most? We're working on this research right now, so I'm showing you relatively new data. And so far, it looks like the answer is people who are lower in numeric confidence, independent of their objective ability, and independent of other cognitive abilities. So I offer this work today not as a departure from Kahneman's work, but as an extension of that work. What I want to do now is talk about just some of our older work, some of our early work on numeracy and decision making. Because people will see the same information and they'll get the same decision options. But ultimately, they end up making different decisions because they have different habits with numbers and with non-numeric information. So the less numerate, it's true that they find numbers harder, they find them more difficult. But what that ends up meaning is that they end up being more vulnerable to the power of compelling stories and images that are shown to them and the emotions that they experience. Ultimately, what that ends up meaning is they're more susceptible to framing effects. So when it comes to a framing effect, the people who are less numerate are the ones who are going to judge a medication treatment as more attractive if it's described as having 90% survival, and is less attractive if it's described as 10% mortality. The highly numerate don't tend to show those effects. The less numerate are also the ones who are more susceptible to those various heuristics, as I mentioned before. They're more susceptible also to just mood states, just incidental mood states that they happen to be in at the moment, that are irrelevant to the decision situation, but they nonetheless pull into their judgments. And they're more susceptible to affective primes. In the end, people who are less numerate just simply neglect numbers more. And the story is very different for the more numerate, because the more numerate have better number habits. And so what they end up doing is they transform numbers in decisions. And so one of the things that we can see is that when you give someone who's highly numerate a medical treatment that has 10% mortality, they more or less automatically transform it into 90% survival or the other way. And as a result, even when you give them one frame of information, they do a little bit of work with the numbers, and in the end, they have more and more complex information available as a result of that transformation. They also spend more time in numeric decisions. Another one of their numeric habits is the idea that they compare numbers more often than the less numerate. And through that comparison process, they derive more meaning from numbers, more affective meaning, that ultimately ends up with them using numbers more. I want to show you some data for the first of three mechanisms. We're going to talk about how the more numerate derive affective meaning from numbers through these comparisons. The other two mechanisms that I'll talk about in a bit have to do with confidence, but we'll hold off on those for a moment. So for this first mechanism, I want to talk about this one particular number habit that people who are highly numerate have more than the less numerate. And I want to describe it through just a very simple, bet study. What we have people do is we have them rate how attractive the prospect of playing the following bet is to them. And they rate it on a scale from 0 to 20. There are two conditions in this study. It's between participants, so they see one of these bets, but they never see the other bet. In one bet that we call the no-loss bet, participants are given 7 chances out of 36 to win $9, and with the remaining chances, they don't win anything. The other bet, which we call just the loss bet, they have that same 7 chances out of 36 to win the same $9, but with the remaining 29 chances out of 36, they would lose a little, about 5 cents. So the loss bet is actually objectively worse, not by a lot, but it is objectively worse. And yet, nonetheless, in a very, very robust way, the loss bet is rated as subjectively more attractive. And not only is the loss bet rated as subjectively more attractive, but when you ask people how they feel about that $9, remember it's the same $9 in both bets, that $9 feels better in the loss bet than it does in the no loss bet. And one of the questions that we started to ask, because we had started to do our work on numeracy at this point in time, is who compares numbers? Does everybody compare numbers? And think back to the life satisfaction study that I showed you a moment ago. What we hypothesized for this study is that it would be the highly numerate who would do the number comparison process. And so what we did is we used the exact same paradigm, but we also had a measure of numeracy. And so what I'm showing here on the y-axis is just that rated attractiveness for playing the bet. I'm going to show you data for the highly numerate on the right and for the less numerate on the left. And what you can see is that it's actually people who are very good with numbers who are the ones who show this finding. They're the ones who rate the loss bet in black as significantly more attractive than the no-loss bet in gray. The people who are less numerate don't really show a difference. The people who are highly numerate are also the ones who are showing that greater positive affect to the $9. The less numerate rated both bets and the feelings towards the $9 about the same. And it was a pretty large effect. Now, at this point in time, I started to hear some constructive criticism that, maybe the reason this effect is appearing is because we used college undergrads. And college undergrads don't know anything about dollars. Their parents are paying all the bills. I suspect some of you out there are doing similar things for your kids. And because of that, they just don't understand dollars, and so they show this funny effect. Or maybe, they're pretty young. Maybe they don't really understand what probabilities are. So we look to a group that are professional numbers people who really do understand dollar values and they really do understand probabilities. And in particular, we turn to actuaries. So I was giving a talk at a Society for Actuaries, and they kindly agreed to let me do an experiment with the people in my audience. So we had about 80 actuaries who averaged about 17 years of actuarial experience. These are true experts with dollars and probabilities. 69% of them had majored in math or statistics. And they showed the largest bets effect that I've seen. They rated that loss bet as significantly more attractive than the no loss bet. And it was a very large effect. What we think happens is that people who are very good with numbers, they have really good habits with numbers. And one of those habits with numbers that people can have is to compare the numbers because they want to understand what the numbers mean. And it's the highly numerate who tend to have more of those number habits. And so the actuaries, despite being excellent with dollars and probabilities, they showed a very large effect, larger than the undergrads even. But let's turn now to numeric confidence. So we've talked a bit about objective numeracy at this point, and that's some of the older findings that we've had. And what I want to talk about now is the idea that, again, when people are getting the same information and they're getting the same decision options, they may have different motivations in decisions. And because of those different motives in decisions, they may make different decisions. And in fact, the people who are more confident, you could call them more efficacious if you want. The people who are more confident tell us that they prefer numbers more. We can also see that they tend to prefer numbers more in things like the BETS study, because independent of that BETS effect that's shown by people who are high in objective numeracy, in that same BETS effect, the people who are high in numeric confidence like both BETS better than people who are low in confidence. And so the people who are more confident just tend to prefer numbers and things with numbers more than the people who are less confident. And as we know from self-efficacy theory and that 40-plus years of work that Albert Bandura did, we know that they also persist more with numbers. And because of this, they end up using their numeric ability more than people who are lower in numeric confidence. The people who are less confident tend to avoid numeric engagement. Again, we know this from Bandura's work. And because of that, they actually, this ends up shaping what they end up ultimately choosing. And so what I want to talk about now are two mechanisms that are associated with confidence. And the first one is that idea that the more confident use their ability and persist. And again, this is Bandura's self-efficacy model. And it's a feedback loop that occurs like with math learning. When you have objective success within math or with numbers, what happens is, and you know it, so you know you've been successful, that increases your confidence. And when you increase your confidence, you tend to persist more. We've shown that correlationally as well as in experimental studies. And when you persist more, you tend to have more success, including with learning, if you happen to be in a learning episode. And with that further learning and further success, you use your math ability even more. And this is Bandura's self-efficacy model in the domain of numbers, pure and simple. And so one of the things that we can show, for example, is that we can manipulate, just very short term, we can alter people's numeric confidence short term, and we can actually get them to persist for longer in an impossible math task compared to those people where we did not manipulate their numeric self-confidence to be higher. And so this idea of confidence and persistence is quite strong, very strong in Bandura's self-efficacy model across a whole variety of domains, and we also see it in the numbers domain. The third mechanism I want to talk about, and this is the one that we're in the process of doing research on right now, is that the less confident feel worse after doing math, and in ways that might actually influence their decision making. And in particular, it may influence how they value options. And let me show you that in kind of three stages, A, B, and C, and then I'll pull the logic together for the ultimate study that we did in decision making. So in mechanism 3A, we turn back to prior literature that shows that when people are making decisions between gambles, they often use a little bit of simple math. They often don't do sort of a full-fledged calculation. They often don't do like an expected value calculation if you give them a gamble, for example. They often don't do that much math, but they'll do like a little bit of math. And so, for example, studies show that if you give somebody a gamble that has a 10% chance to win, they'll transform that over into like a 90% chance to lose. They do just a little bit of math. And there are other number operations they do too. But it turns out that even though that kind of math is probably quite trivial to everybody in this room, it's not trivial to everybody. And in fact, people who have lower numeric confidence, they tend to have more negative emotions to math. And they'll tell you that. They'll tell you, I hate math. I don't like it. It makes me feel bad. Excuse me. But if people who have, the data that have existed have been mostly correlational. And so if you ask people sort of their feelings about math and they're lower in confidence, they will tell you they have negative emotions to math. But we were interested in whether we could show that experimentally. And so we did a fairly simple study where we wanted to see whether doing math put some people in a worse mood. And in particular, what we did is we had people come into the lab and we gave them either a verbal test, a verbal analogy test, or an equally difficult math test. And then we simply measured their mood afterwards. We simply asked them, how good or bad do you feel now after having done one or the other of those tests? What I'm showing on my y-axis here is the extent of positive mood that people showed after doing this test. I have my people higher in numeric confidence on the right and lower in numeric confidence on the left. And what you can see is that for people who are higher in numeric confidence, it doesn't make much of a difference whether you give them a verbal test, this was a verbal analogy test, or a math test. They're in pretty positive moods regardless. But for people who are lower in numeric competence, they're actually in a significantly worse mood after they've done a math test than after they did that verbal analogy test. They felt worse because they had to do something that wasn't how they thought of themselves. So for people who don't think of themselves as a math person, they don't like math, and it makes them feel worse when they have to do it. And we ask them to do it. Now, mechanism 3 is this idea that emotion might be used as information to figure out how much an option is valued. And so just kind of pulling that logic together, what we think happens if you give people a choice between a risky option and a certain option, that people first will do a little bit of math while deciding. And there is math to be done when it comes to a gamble, but there's not math to be done when it comes to a certain choice. And then second, if they do a little math, and even past research shows if they anticipate doing math, that they're going to get into a somewhat worse mood. They're going to feel worse. And then the question we had is negative emotion then used as information to infer that numerically harder options have lower value? And for this, we have to turn to Schwarz and Clor's feelings as information framework. And what that framework is, it's the idea, it's usually used with incidental affect, or mood states. It's the idea that when you have a mood state that's external to a decision situation, people will, so it's irrelevant to the decision, people will often use that affect as information to make some judgment. And here what we assumed is that people might also use task-generated mood states. So in this case, emotion that's generated from doing a math task. For some people, more than other people. And what we hypothesized then is that numerically harder options would be the ones that are chosen less, and especially by people who are lower in numeric confidence. And so we did a couple of studies. Again, this is research that's in process, but the two studies show very similar results, and so I thought you might find them of interest. In the first study, we had undergraduate participants do 24 choices. We had about 200 participants, and they did choices like this. So they chose between a certain option, $13 for sure, and a risky option, 45 chances to win $30. And what we thought would happen is that people would do a little math with the gamble. And if they were lower in numeric confidence, they might feel a little worse. And if they felt a little worse, they might value that option less and might be more likely to choose the amount of money for sure. And in fact, what we showed is that people who are lower in numeric confidence, 70% of them chose the sure thing option, compared to only 50% of people who are higher in numeric confidence who chose that same sure thing option. These results held after controlling for objective numeracy, for 2 measures of non-numeric intelligence, and also for the expected value differences between the gamble and sure thing each time. People who don't feel good about their math abilities seem to give up value, give up some welfare in a sense, because they choose differently based on their experience going through that choice. In study 2, we had just a single choice, but it was incentivized in this case. Participants had gone through just a completely unrelated study, and then at the very end, we surprised them with a bonus. But we didn't just give them money, we gave them a choice. We told them you can either have 50 cents, a real 50 cents, or if you want to try to, want to gamble a little bit, you have a 50% chance of a $1 bonus, so they could get twice as much money. The expected values, of course, are the same. What we found was that people who are lower in numeric confidence, 82% of them chose the sure thing, compared to only 65% of those people who are higher in numeric confidence. This effect, once again, is independent of objective numeracy. And so we have this interesting set of mechanisms. We talked about 3 of them. The first one is that the more numerate derive affective meaning from numerical comparisons that they are more likely to take compared to the less numerate. We talked about numeric confidence determining whether people use their ability and whether they persist even when the going gets tough. And then this last one, that the emotional experience of simply doing a little bit of math might feed directly into how people value what it is that they're choosing. Now what I want to show you is, I want to sort of go to the next step. and talk about what this framework implies for designing possible behavioral interventions. The mechanism framework that I've described generates some a priori predictions about who benefits from which intervention, and it tells us a little bit about what hypothesized mechanisms, mediators, that you might want to measure. At this point, the rows that I'm going to show you vary in how directly they've been tested at this point. Some of them have been tested quite a bit, some of them not very much. The first row is actually pretty well established. Less numerate people we know tend to extract less affective meaning from numbers. And when that happens, the target is to make that meaning available. There are multiple ways of doing it. You can do it through frequency formats. I'll show you some data on this. You can do it through interpretive labels is another way of doing it. And these kind of interventions don't improve numeracy in any way. They just go around the gap. And I'll show you that frequency example in a second. The second row has some strong general evidence, but the specific 2x2 targeting is still emerging. It combines a very strongly published mechanism of persistence and that emerging unpublished work that I showed you a moment ago about math moods. Both mechanisms, though, do tend to point to the same broad intervention implication. When low confidence people disengage from numbers or they avoid numerically harder options, the target isn't to try to change someone's confidence, because that's hard to do, but it's to try to remove those persistence barriers. And you might be able to remove persistence barriers through less information and simpler formats, maybe defaults that protect people who otherwise are not engaging with the numbers. And so if you can take away things being tough, you might get those people who don't persist to do better in their decisions and to improve their decision quality. Another way to think about it is that people who are low in confidence, they don't have motivation in decisions that involve numbers. And so maybe we can increase motivation in some other ways. And I'll show you a possible example of that as well. Again, in each of these cases, we're not trying to improve confidence. We're trying to design around it. The third row has to do with number preferences. Remember, the people who are high in numeric confidence, they tell us they prefer numbers more compared to people low in confidence. And this is related to the Betts effect, as I was mentioning a minute ago. This particular row is theoretically motivated, but it awaits, in terms of intervention, it awaits direct tests in the field. It does have strong empirical support for some work I'm going to show you by another group that's led by Chang. And you'll see that this particular row applies to the highly confident in particular. I'm going to walk through each of these, explaining existing evidence, and explaining also, though, where we have a prediction, but we don't yet have data. So the first example I want to walk you through, the first intervention, has to do with how can you communicate affect through numbers to people like the less numerate people who don't extract much affective meaning on their own. And so in this particular case, the question that I'm asking is kind of silly in some ways. Is a 10% chance versus 10 chances out of 100 the same risk or a different risk? Well, of course we know they're logically identical. But the question is, are they the same or are they different in communicating risk? And it turns out that they actually are different. So when you tell someone that there's a 10% risk of something, a 10% chance of something negative happening, what they often report back is that, oh, that's a small number. It's kind of abstract. It doesn't mean much to me. But if you tell them 10 out of 100 people might have that same bad thing happening, they often imagine a person having that thing happen to them or doing that thing in the example I'm going to show you. And they feel more affect. And they end up perceiving more risk in the situation. But we were interested in whether people who differ in objective numeracy might actually differ in how they respond to these problems. And so I want to show you one of the early studies that we did. In this particular study, participants are asked to imagine that they're evaluating a patient for discharge from a mental health facility. And this patient, Mr. Jones, is being evaluated for discharge now. And a psychologist whose opinion you respect has done an assessment of Mr. Jones and has reached the following conclusions. Everybody reads this information, and then they're randomly assigned to one of two groups. One of the groups is a probability condition. Of every 100 patients similar to Mr. Jones, 10% are estimated to commit an act of violence. Then they're asked, how much risk do you perceive from Mr. Jones if he's discharged at this time? The other group is in a frequency condition. You will notice it is eerily similar to the probability condition. Out of every 100 patients similar to Mr. Jones, 10 are estimated to commit an act of violence. I'm highlighting the difference between these two conditions to you, but these, of course, are not highlighted for participants. What we think happens is that people who are highly numerate, they're going to transform numbers. Probably as each of you out in the audience did, when they see 10%, they also think of 10 out of 100. When they think of 10 out of 100, they also think about 10%. And so we hypothesized that they would transform numbers and they would perceive about the same risk for Mr. Jones being discharged, regardless of which format they were given. For the people who are less numerate, though, we thought that they wouldn't transform numbers and that, in fact, they would see fairly large risk differences. On my y-axis here is the perceived risk ratings to Mr. Jones. I'm showing you the more numerate people on the right, and what you can see is regardless of whether they were given the frequency information in red or the probability information in blue, they perceived about the same risk for Mr. Jones. Very different from the less numerate, who perceived much more risk for Mr. Jones when they were given that information in the frequency format. This effect remains after controlling for SAT scores as a relatively poor proxy for intelligence. There are multiple ways that you can make affective meaning available for numbers. One way is what I just showed you, is using that kind of frequency information instead of probabilities. You can also use things like interpretive labels, but there are different ways that you can do it. But the important thing is that less numerate people don't derive as much affective meaning from numbers, and so sometimes they need a little bit more help so that they can figure out what the numbers mean for the decision they have at hand. The next thing I want to turn to is possible interventions for people who are low in numeric confidence, and thinking about what interventions might target the persistence pathway and that math moods pathway, where low confidence people avoid or undervalue numerically harder options. And one of the things that we think works is by reducing cognitive effort. I mentioned that briefly a moment ago. And I want to show you kind of an older study that we did where we had subjects choosing among 3 hospitals based on cost and quality and other information. In this design, hospitals that cost more are also higher in quality. So there's a meaningful trade-off that participants have to make. And we're going to try to force them, we're going to try to get them to choose higher quality hospitals more. We had 2 conditions. Both of them included cost information. One of them had all the information, which meant about 9 attributes. One of them had quality and cost information only, which meant about 5 attributes for each hospital. This is the information that people were given when they were randomly assigned to get all information. They always had those out-of-pocket costs. They had quality of care information. Everybody got the quality of care information. And I'm pointing that out with arrows to you right now. And so that's things like the proportion of time that guidelines for heart attack care are followed. On top of that quality information, though, people in this particular condition also got other non-quality information, things like the number of general care beds. And this information is fairly similar to what hospital quality of care websites actually do provide. People are given this information to try to help them make better decisions, but if they find some information irrelevant, they're just expected to be able to just kind of work their way around it. And for people who are good with complex tables, this may seem relatively simple. It might seem pretty easy to kind of figure out what you would choose and to understand the information. But for people who aren't good with complex tables, this is a lot of information. And so in the other condition, we gave people a reduced set of information. We gave them the cost information, of course, and we gave them all of that quality information. And then everybody was asked questions just about the quality information because everybody got it. And so they were asked 3 questions about quality of care. What we ended up finding is that less can be more. that people understood more when less information was chosen, and that was especially true for people who are lower in numeracy. That's not super surprising from the extent of, we know that people who are very low in numeracy, they don't do well when they're distracted by other information. But this result might be a little bit more surprising, because people also chose the highest quality hospital more with less information, and that was true whether they were lower in numeracy or they were higher in numeracy. As if the quality information could be understood, but it couldn't be used as well when more information was present. And so what we think happens for people who are lower in ability, we think that it either overwhelmed their cognitive abilities, or we think at this point that it might have been actually that they were low in numeric confidence and they didn't persist. Now, in this particular study, we were only measuring objective numeracy at this time. We had not turned to this idea of numeric confidence. But I suspect if we were to rerun this study now and we were to measure both of those constructs, what we would find is that this is a persistence problem. That people who are low in ability are also the ones who tend to be lower in confidence, and they simply didn't persist through this problem. And so they didn't understand as much, and they weren't as able to make choices that maximized the quality of the hospital that they chose. Now, for the people who are highly numerate, we're not quite as sure what might have been going on. It could be that there just was enough information here, enough trade-offs to be made, that they also couldn't keep things in mind, and they either maybe got overwhelmed cognitively, I kind of doubt that, or they had a persistence problem, actually, and especially because this is a hypothetical problem. They just chose to stop persisting at that point. But again, we didn't measure numeric confidence here. I think the mechanism probably is numeric confidence, but what we actually measured was objective ability here. The next case I want to look at are the high ability, low confidence people. And ask the question of what interventions might target those people who have genuine numeric skills like Ruth did, but they aren't using them and they don't persist. And here what we thought is that the target might actually be motivation. And there are multiple ways that you can increase motivation and choices, but one way that we've looked at and that I'd like to test at some point with these measures. We didn't actually test it in this particular study, but it's the idea of increasing motivation through the pleasure of choice. And so it turns out that people like having choice, even if having a choice doesn't really add much of anything for them. But having choice increases perceptions that people have control over the situation. It increases perceptions that beneficial outcomes are going to come about. It also increases the affective value of options. It recruits reward-related neural circuitry, and it increases curiosity. And so we had an hypothesis that if we presented people with multiple vaccines during the COVID-19 pandemic, a chosen option, something that they got to choose, would have higher people would report being more likely to vaccinate, and they would have more positive affect to that vaccine than the same option that was offered to them, but without allowing them choice. And I think that this way of increasing motivation might actually have some positive effects on particularly people who are high in ability but low in confidence. It might provide that motivation. But let me just show you quickly what these results are. So we did this study right in the middle of COVID-19. We actually did 2 studies. I'm only going to show you the first study. Both studies show similar effects. Just checking how I'm doing on time here. There were 3 conditions. 2 were no-choice conditions where people were either assigned to get Pfizer or they were assigned to get Moderna, but they were given information on both vaccines. Alternatively, they were given, again, information on both vaccines, but they were allowed to choose. They read about vaccines, they were asked to choose if they were allowed to, and then they indicated the likelihood that they would get that vaccine. And they indicated how they felt about the vaccine that they were offered or accepted. Just checking okay, I need to go a little bit faster here, my apologies. What we found in study 1 was that vaccine likelihood was almost twice as high in the choice condition than the no choice conditions. So 44% of people were predicted to be quite likely to completely certain to get vaccinated in that choice condition compared to only 23% of no choice participants. Study 2 results, again, were similar. And so there's a general finding here about choice and motivation that may have implications for numeric engagement, and in particular for those people who are high in ability. They can use their number skills, but they simply don't have the confidence to use those skills. And so if you can increase their motivation in some other way, that might actually help that population in particular. That's an hypothesis at this point. We haven't actually tested it, but I think that general notion that we have this ability to increase motivation through certain manipulations that we can do is an interesting one. The last intervention I want to show you, I want to sort of have you get a feel for it as we're going through it. And what I want you to imagine is that you're on vacation and you have to pick between two hotels, between Hotel Milton and Hotel Lux. And I want you, which one of these would you prefer? So how many people would prefer Milton? Okay. How many people would instead prefer Lux? Okay. We have quite a few more people who would prefer Milton. And that, in fact, is what people tend to prefer. They tend to prefer, in this study, they preferred the less expensive Hotel Milton. But wipe your minds clean for a minute, if you don't mind, and I'm going to give you the same choice again. Sort of. But I changed it a little bit. Would you prefer Hotel Milton or Hotel Lux in this case? In the study, more people prefer higher quality Hotel Lux. What seems to happen is that what you'll notice between these two different versions of the study, of course, is that I changed where we used numerals, where we quantified an attribute, and where we didn't quantify an attribute. And it turns out that when attributes are quantified, it kind of shines a spotlight of attention, and people are more likely to use that quantified attribute than the non-quantified attribute. I wrote about this idea. I hadn't tested it, but I wrote about this idea back in 2020. Measurable and comparable quantities like costs will tend to direct decisions, while more difficult to measure, but sometimes more important attributes will fade into the background. In the meantime, since then, just very recently, Chang and some of her colleagues actually did a beautiful set of studies on exactly this idea. And what they found was that when decision makers face numeric and non-numeric dimensions, they base decisions disproportionately on the numeric dimensions. But in particular, it's the more numerically confident decision makers who are more susceptible, not less. Remember, they prefer numbers. And economists, I suspect that many of you might be highly confident with numbers. Economists are probably not immune to this effect. But measurability does not equal importance when it comes to attributes. Numbers are essential, and they are underused in some domains, as I've been talking about. But this bias is real, and it comes with a particular signal of an individual difference measure, and it's those people who are higher in numeric confidence. So I've talked today about 4 strategies. One is to use frequency formats for the less numerate people who don't derive affective meaning from numbers. Frequencies can help. So can interpretive labels. I've talked about reducing numeric load, and that might help with that persistence barrier or the math moods barrier, and for low confidence people in particular. This is hypothesized. We haven't looked at it yet. I've also talked about another hypothesized effect, that we might be able to increase choice motivation, again, as a way of getting around that persistence problem. And we think that might help the people who are high in ability but low in confidence, like my friend Ruth. And then finally, we talked about this idea of quantification fixation, that we fixate on quantities, and that a strategy of choosing what to quantify may be important sometimes, and that it's situation dependent. People who are high in numeric confidence, you sometimes might want to change what is quantified in order to get them to weight some attributes more that they perhaps aren't weighting at the moment. Or for people who are low in numeric confidence, you might want to think about that idea as well. I wanted to go through just a quick illustration that combines the first 2 of those strategies. My Uncle John was about 85 years old, and he was at high risk for stroke and taking a drug called Coumadin. His doctor would give him instructions. He had to change his medication fairly frequently. The drug is pretty dangerous. You want to keep it at a safe level. You don't want it to get too high, and you don't want to get it too low because of the side effects that are associated. And the doctor would give him instructions like this, to please take your medication differently and decrease your dose in particular ways. But I realized, because I lived close by my uncle at the time, that he had no idea what the doctor was saying. And in fact, this is approximately what he heard. And doctors just aren't trained to deal with patients who are less numerate, because there are things you can do. And so what I did for my uncle is every time he came back with these instructions from his doctor, I would just translate for him. Your INR level is too high. It made no difference if he knew what the level was. He just needed to know it was too high. He did need to know the 5 milligram tabs because he had to check it against his prescription drug bottle. But otherwise, he just needed someone to lay out the days of the week for him and draw out those number of pills. So kind of like the frequency format, he needed a visual image that was associated with a day of the week that would then allow him to turn data into information and to take charge of his own health. These are solvable problems that physicians have. They're not trained to do this kind of thing, however. So in conclusion, a lot of people are innumerate out there. And when they're bad with numbers, they tend to be bad with decisions. But for better or for worse, being objectively numerate does not guarantee better decisions and outcomes. But as we know from the motivational mind framework, being numerically confident also doesn't guarantee better outcomes. It's the interaction that's important. And that objective numeracy and numeric confidence just simply relate to different psychological mechanisms in decisions. And those mechanisms explain patterns that neither construct alone can explain. The more numerate have better numeric habits. They transform and compare, and they spend time on numeric decisions. But the motivational mind network drives confidence-related persistence. When the going gets tough, they continue on, and they deliberate in some contexts. It also predicts more intuitive and emotional processing in other contexts. And knowing which mechanism is operating for which person in which decision environment is what generates useful predictions about intervention effectiveness. There are a lot more studies that need to be done to test this framework. It's sort of in its infancy. The practical reach of this research, though, is broader than any single intervention study. Understanding these numerical mechanisms, these numeric competencies, has highlighted the importance of mathematical ability, not just to STEM careers, but to everyday life. Across the lifespan, across populations, across the decisions that most affect our well-being. It's helped identify interventions that work. And we've taken that work into engagement with federal agencies and policymakers and the public. When the rubber hits the road, it's the people who have to make the decisions about their health, their finances, their responses to climate and technology and policy. And in the end, numeric confidence may be that missing piece that helps us with heterogeneous treatment effects along with objective numeracy. Behind every heterogeneous treatment effect is a person with a particular relationship to numbers, to their difficulty, their meaning, their emotional weight. Understanding that relationship is, I think, an important missing piece in making behavioral interventions work for the people who need them most. Thank you very much. I'd also like to point out, if you're interested in learning more about this kind of numeracy research, I have a book. It actually just came out in paperback about a month ago, and they gave me a promotion code for you guys if you're interested. You do have to go up onto the global Oxford University Press website, though, to be able to use it. And I'm happy to take questions at this point if anyone's interested. Yeah? I think maybe if we wait for the microphone, if that's okay. It's right behind you.
I have maybe two questions, but in fact, this is all the time the same.
Yeah.
Let us take this lost bet that was more attractive than the other one, okay? Why do we need to tell about affect related to numbers? It's just comparative judgment, yeah, and reference points. So can you convince me that if you introduce affect, it will be more, or it will be something else, okay? Second, this Mr. Jones experiment, the same story, like this probability and frequency format. Gegerenzer, for example, would explain in completely different way that probability people just do not understand. So this is the reason, and this 10 out of 100 or whatever, they can understand. So here is the difference. So again, my question is, do you really think that introducing imagery into interpretation of this experiment is better than, I don't know, this traditional interpretation of frequency and probability? I don't say that Gegerenzer is right. I just want to know your interpretation. And the last experiment with choices, which I didn't know before, of vaccines, well, for example, we can interpret this talking about illusion of control, okay? Like this experiment by Langer, when people could choose a deck from which they draw cards, and when they could choose, they of course feel more happy, and it was competition and choice, it gave them illusion of control. So again, my question is, maybe it is this, not affect.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm not sure I caught everything that you said. You talked about 3 different experiments, the Betts effect, the Mr. Jones study, and the vaccine study. And if I understood correctly, your general question is, why do I need affect as the explanation in those studies? Yeah. Okay, good. I did catch that apart. So I work from the tradition of the affect heuristic. And in the affect heuristic, if you know that, that's work by Paul Slovic and myself and Don McGregor and Melissa Finucane. What we found across a whole variety of different studies is that affect seems to explain a variety of effects. And so starting with work by Antonio Damasio, for example, the affect that you experience when you're considering an option, whether that's how risky is a nuclear power plant or how much do you want to play this bet. When you experience affect, you use the information that's there. And you use that affect as information, in fact, in order to come up with some judgment or to guide some choice. And so in the cases that we've looked at, like the 3 that you just pointed out, we measure affect because we think that affect is not only an important but a critical component to decision making that allows people to use information or not use information. There is also a lot of mechanism-related information that's available that supports that affect is this important component. Some of that is used through self-report measures of affect, like what I've just been showing you here, but other measures are through physiological measures. And so we have some donations, some charity donation studies, for example, where we measure galvanic skin response, and we show the same kind of relationship. Other people look at brain-related neural mechanisms associated with emotion-related areas of the brain. So there's a variety of research that supports this notion that when we have affective, good, bad feelings towards something, that we use that as information to try to figure out what's going on, and we often use it as substitute information for something else. And so instead of using probabilities or using dollar values or using the actual risks and benefits of nuclear power, we instead use our feelings about things to guide the subsequent judgment. That's the tradition that I'm coming from. Yeah, right in front. And we've got a microphone coming your way.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I enjoyed it a lot. I had, there were so many results that I had also many questions or comments. I'll try to not be too long. One thing on the last thing with the hotels that I think might be part of the explanation is that when you see a dollar, and so you had in the one version you showed the price as one packet of bills versus 4 packet of bills as
in that last
ranking
in the
how
chain.
expensive. Maybe when you see this, you might imagine that the price difference is 50% more or 70% more. You don't think about 4 times higher, and then the impression that you get about the price difference is just completely different from seeing 100 versus 400. So,
Can I add a little detail to the method? I didn't tell you all the details. People were told right there that each of those little icons was worth $100.
okay.
So they were actually told it was worth $100. They just didn't put $400 there. They were instead given 4 icons, each of which was worth $100.
Okay, so that
They presumably knew, assuming they read the instructions. Yeah, isn't that interesting? I like that study a lot. It's a beautiful paper if any of you want to go look at it.
Sure, yeah. And with the hospital, it seemed to me that the one that was ranked low in quality, that had, it was very good in the meals and very good in the visiting hours. So maybe when you give the simplified version with less information, it's not just that people are less, that they are not, the information that is omitted in the simplified version is information that is particularly good for the hospital that was of low quality. So maybe it's not that surprising that it shifts the decisions towards the high quality hospital. Maybe, I think you may mention that you want to run some further things along those lines, and maybe the differences should be more neutral on the dimensions that you omit, because otherwise it could rationalize the behavior.
So you're suggesting in that study, if I understand correctly, that the information that we took away does actually point towards different choices, and so maybe that information changed what attributes people thought was important.
Yeah, I think the attributes that were omitted were particularly good for the low quality hospital, and then if you omit them, it can, even for someone rational and even in choices that are within subjects, if you omit that information, it could lead to choose the better quality hospital.
Yeah, what we were trying to do there was actually we were actually working for a health insurance company, and what they were interested in specifically was methods that would guide people towards choosing higher quality hospitals. What you're suggesting is that part of the effect might come from the non-quality of care information and the fact that it kind of pointed towards those other attributes, towards other choices. What I'd suggest is I see what you're saying. I think it's still important to know this, and it was important for this health insurance company to know this, that non-quality information that they do not want people using because they want their customers to choose higher quality hospitals so that they get better care, so that it costs the health insurance company less money. It's important for them to know that that by including more information, you could accidentally get people to choose in a different way. I see what you mean methodologically, though. I'll have to go back and look at the materials.
Okay. And I have a couple more, but I'll just say one. Yeah. In mechanism 3B, you had the people who were low in the numeracy confidence, ranking lower, having lower mood after the test of the numerical test. Yeah. But even though the correlation is not perfect, as you said, there is still a positive correlation between numeric ability and numeric confidence. So I would suspect that they also did more poorly than the group with the high numeric confidence. And if you do a test and you feel that you did it badly, it's not that surprising that your mood is worse, even if it doesn't relate to the numeric confidence. So I wonder if you might want to control for the numeric ability there? If you did, I don't know, but in the graph it didn't seem to control.
Yeah, we did actually control for objective ability there. We also controlled for 2 measures of non-numeric intelligence. So those results were robust to controlling for objective math ability, to verbal ability, and I believe to Raven's progressive matrices was the last one. And then we also controlled for expected, and that one, that was the math test one. So yeah, we controlled for objective ability and for verbal intelligence. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, so, yeah, robust too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, a great talk. And also thank you for telling economists to underemphasize numerical data, especially in promotion decisions.
Sometimes.
You mentioned Bandura a couple of times.
Yeah.
I'm not a psychologist, as you know, but he's also known for social cognitive theory, right? And I think this may, if I understand that very well, it may be relevant for your Ruth example, because she did show numeric confidence in the supermarket, right? Because she's willing to challenge the cashier, at which point, and she seems to be right about this. Have you thought about actually, I think this is consistent with Bandura's idea of social cognitive theory, that it actually is domain specific. How do people think about actually transferring this type of confidence, context-dependent confidence, in order to have more confidence in other settings without having to go through the techniques like frequency probabilities, fights with Gigerenzer, and all these other things? Sorry, that's a joke at the end.
Yeah, I think I'll skip the fight with Gigerenzer. So your question, if I understand it, is essentially how can you get people to bring in some other form of intelligence into a number-related domain that then helps them to have confidence because they have confidence in that other domain. And so with Ruth in particular, she had a lot of confidence in shopping. And so she didn't think about it. If I had to guess, and I did talk with her a little bit about it afterwards, she didn't think about shopping as a number-related task. It was just shopping. You know, she went and bought things, and she didn't like to be cheated. And she was going to tell you if she thought. And I think your question is really interesting. How do you label something, for example, as if it's in a different domain so that people can bring that confidence into a number-related domain? I haven't thought about that particularly. There's some research in social psychology that suggests that you can give people you can give people the same test, but you can label it as an intelligence test, or as, I think they labeled it as problem solving otherwise. And you get people to respond very differently depending upon what you label it. And that's essentially the idea that you're talking about, I think. But I don't know. I think it's a super interesting question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That was a great lecture. I have an additional question, like seconding offer concerning the hotel study. Yeah. Because in the first version, where there were stars for quality, there was a benchmark, so you could get 3 out of 5 or 5 out of 5
for the cost information.
For the quality information.
For the quality.
And in the second version, it was just ranking 3 and ranking
that's gonna
5.
take too long.
Yeah. So my question was whether those participants knew that it was 3 out of something and 5 out of something.
Yes, they always knew.
Okay.
Yeah,
so they knew that 5 is max here.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. In these kind of slides, I end up not showing the full materials because it gets too crowded. But yes, it's a very good question. But they did know what it was out of, so they knew what the boundaries were.
Thank you. A brief question about a policy dilemma. So, in the UK, broadcast media produce weather forecasts where uncertainty is purely verbal. There's some chance it might rain this afternoon, or that sort of thing. Whereas, in the States, as you know, there's a 52% chance of precipitation in the downtown area this afternoon. So, in the first case, we're pandering up to low numerate people. In the second case, we're pandering up to high numerate people. Which is best? I mean, my argument would be, at least if you give probabilities, you're giving the low numerate people a chance to learn. They'll find these are so well calibrated, these weather forecasts. They'll find that if there's there's a 30% chance of rain in the afternoon, 30% of the time they walk out, it'll rain. And so that'll help them learn about probabilities. What would your advice be?
So I have, in fact, taken the same take that you just took, which is we want a more numerate population, and the only way we're going to get a more numerate population is if we give people a chance to experience numbers, and to experience numbers in low-risk kinds of situations where they'll hopefully start to learn more over time. It is also the case, it does, as you say, pander to some extent to one population versus another. But in general, people do prefer getting numbers. And in fact, when you give them numeric information, they're much more likely on social media to share that information. They find it more trustworthy. The effects are larger for people who are more numerate. They're smaller for people who are less numerate. But the preference does tend to remain. Maybe not for the very least numerate people, though.
Thank you. I hope your advice gets through to the British consultant.
I will keep trying. You guys have actually a lovely group in the UK. Is it the National Numeracy Network? I forgot what the name of it is. But you have a lovely numeracy group in the UK that has an online module to help people get practice with numbers and become more numerate. If you're ever interested, I could go dig it out for you and tell you.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. I hate to think I'm keeping people from lunch, by the way, because I just noticed what time it is. Uh-oh. Feel free
I just
to
want to
leave if
quickly
you'd like.
follow up on this, because when you showed numeracy into the wild and
I'm
positive...
sorry, can you say that again?
Sure, I just want to follow up quickly on
Yeah.
this discussion. When you showed the slide where you had the positive financial outcomes with the general population sample and showed the interaction, you talked about 3 circles, but you didn't talk about the 4th circle. Those were the low confidence, low numeracy people. They were actually the second best group in your entire sample. So if you think about it, they were doing much better than the high numeracy, low confidence people.
Yeah.
So those people, making those people more numerate would actually hurt them.
Yeah, so we actually don't know for sure what's happening with them, but in both slides you might notice that the slope of the line is much stronger for the highly confident, and it's much less strong for the less confident. And what we think happens is that the high ability are using that ability, the high confident are using their ability for better and for worse. But the people who are low in confidence are simply not using their ability. But we think that people who match, people who are low in ability and low in confidence, we think that they might be the people who might be the most likely to be offered help and accept it, who might request help. So we think maybe they're getting help externally, but that's a speculation at this point. But that's what we think, what we think might happen there. Great, thank you. Appreciate all the questions. I'm sorry. Oh.
Wait a second. I have one interesting thing to tell you. Remember that tonight we have a dinner and you must be in the lobby of Hotel Luz at 8:30, okay? So now you're free to go.
Thank you.
Sorry, the little present.